Technically, some of this happens on day 4, but let's just roll with it. We left off with Levitt lying on the floor in the midst of a massive seizure while Stone was trying to help Burton. Burton was in the autopsy room when Andromeda broke containment, and he's panicked, and understandably so. And now Levitt is laid up in the infirmary recovering, meaning that the only one to help Stone is Hall, the one who, in Stone's unvoiced opinion, is least capable of doing so. Well, in his current state, Burton is no use to anyone. In fact, he's demanding that he be treated with Callison, a wonder drug that is basically the cure to, well, everything, including cancer. The reason it's not used is because, while it cures all diseases, once the patient is taken off the drug, they die of obscure superinfections within hours. Callison seems to be one of Crichton's less considered ideas. If you search the internet, any mention of it tends to be only what I've just told you. Yet it is curious that Crichton introduces this. First, because it is something that is merely discussed and never actually used, so it is in no way an effect on the events of the book, and it is not part of the preparations for Wildfire or related to any of the other operations, such as Project Scoop, which might discuss contingencies that won't be used to show the thoroughness. But since Callison isn't one, it must be something that Crichton wanted to discuss anyway. Yet the idea behind it is strange. Callison's ability to kill bacteria, viruses, and invasive fungi, as well as cancer, without harming complex organisms, is an astonishing ability to give it. Yet Stone is one of several who warns against the drug's use, and is proven right, with the nasty fates that its subjects meet. In the one sense, it sounds like Crichton is speaking to the resistant strains of bacteria that have emerged, like MRSA. Yet Crichton clearly uses the word all several times. Not most, not nearly all, just all creatures die. So it's not the survivors that are rendered immune, and it wouldn't explain the bizarre deaths anyway, like a brain turning to jelly all of a sudden. One interpretation I did manage to track down was the only logical one I could consider, which is that the immune system simply shuts down. But even that makes little sense, since the stuff isn't supposed to affect humans besides cancer cells. And the objection wasn't couched in those terms, but in throwing off the body's natural balance. Which is all well and good, but everyone in this facility has had that thrown off as well. Crichton has spent not just paragraphs or pages, but chapters detailing how they are killing off all of the microbes on or in the arriving team members. It is likely, therefore, that Crichton has introduced this because of its application to the theme. Humans are meddling in things they don't really understand. Callison, like all of this wonderful technology, is the answer to our dreams, but we don't understand its effect well enough, and so it will ultimately doom us all. As I said, that fits the theme, but it's a bit dubious, and it's hardly the only error in the book. There is a plot thread regarding a discovered bone from the pilot that is left unresolved, despite the implications that Andromeda has become a flesh-consuming microbe. So Burton is refused Callison, instead getting pure oxygen, because oxygen is the gas that is least effective for growth of Andromeda. But Hall thinks over everything that they know, including an offhand remark that Stone makes, that Burton is, quote, scared to death. He goes through the events, the blood clotting, except blood clotting wasn't connected to Jackson or to the baby. And it doesn't get stated, but diabetics actually have the opposite problem. They have a tendency to get blood clots. Yet that trooper succumbed to madness the same way that all those people with their clotting problems did. So it would have to be something else in his case. Diabetics can have complications that make the blood more acidic. The same problem that Jackson had filling up on aspirin, which is an acid, and sterno, which contains methanol, which breaks down into acid inside the body. But that doesn't apply to the baby. And then there were the birds that were unaffected around Piedmont. So Hall realizes that one thing the baby and the birds have in common is that they breathed rapidly, and that in human beings, when you have high acid, you breathe rapidly to expel carbon dioxide to reduce the acidic level. He realizes that the issue is a narrow range of blood pH. Anything within that and Andromeda is fine. Anything outside and it can't reproduce. So instead of pumping in oxygen, Hall tells Burton to keep breathing heavy until he can get something to change his blood pH. But it turns out that this is all for nothing, as it's noted that while all these steps are being taken to protect Burton, there's a rat in the room. A rat that is alive and well with no special effort to survive. Hall has also figured this out. Andromeda has mutated. This was something they had feared would happen if the President went ahead with cautery, because it turns out Andromeda perfectly converts energy into matter and the other way around. There is no loss there. So, if a nuclear weapon had gone off, it would have, instead of destroying the pathogen, had spread it everywhere and given it plenty of energy to reproduce. And since mutation occurs during reproduction, all kinds of new mutant strains would be created and spread all over the place. Well, Hall figures what happened was that Andromeda had already mutated when they arrived in Piedmont, that the lethal pathogen had been replaced by one that ate a synthetic polymer instead, how it destroyed the stuff in the plane, and how it's breaking containment now. It is, to humans, harmless. But that's when Andromeda completely breaches containment, and the computers presume that it is a potential risk for release to the surface and the start of an epidemic. Thus, the nuke needs to be detonated, which again would not only help Andromeda, but mutate this safe form into all kinds of things that are likely going to be deadly. So Hall has to enter his disarmament key, but there's yet another problem. Somebody screwed up on the blueprints, and not every section has a substation to do that. It's going to be corrected next month, if there is a next month. Thus, Hall is forced to work his way through levels while being exposed to tranquilizers that were intended to stop escaping lab animals, barely stopping the disaster in time. I don't have to tell you that this is another example of technology being great, but not prepared to make the human-level decisions that are needed because it nearly doomed us all by following its programming. And likewise, the continued theme of humans being too fallible in the end, no matter how many precautions they might take. But the day was saved, and Stone intends to keep studying Andromeda to see what they can learn. This is no surprise. Crichton has effectively worked to usurp the expectation. Stone is presented as what we would expect to be the hero. He's brilliant, has great foresight, is effectively the leader here, and has specialized skills that no one else does. And yet, Crichton makes Hall the hero. In a look at his work, the reason is obvious. Stone is representative of a character archetype that Crichton frequently indicates, the man who loses touch because of his reliance on science and technology. Crichton's first work, The Most Important Man in the Lab, is of a man who sounds very much like Stone, who runs a student lab and is clearly presented in a negative light because he has allowed it to shut down the basic human decency that is necessary. I've mentioned several times Crichton's background in medicine. What I didn't mention was that when the time came, after completing all the work required and gaining all of the real-world experience necessary to get his license to practice medicine, he didn't. The reason is given that he was disillusioned with how the doctors were more concerned with reputation and pursuing their own interests than in the well-being of their patients. And so naturally, while we pick up with Hall going into surgery to help save a life, we have Stone, who is at a party schmoozing the movers and shakers in academia. While Stone is buttoned up in his fortress of solitude he's built pursuing research, Hall is focused upon the humans, his patients, his assistants, following up on leads in the outside world, even having a romantic interest in the voice that it turns out is just pre-recorded by an elderly woman. Meanwhile, Stone is presented as being resentful to have to waste space on someone focused on application rather than theory, has been married multiple times, and to wives of his colleagues no less, and even when he leaves his wife during the party, it seems more cold than reassuring. This is not to say that Stone is presented as a villain, or that Hall is presented as a saint either, as the book describes Hall as having a reputation as, quote, a swift, quick-tempered, and unpredictable surgeon. But we see that Stone is endemic of the problems in science and medicine, more interested in his ivory tower, even when that tower extends into the ground rather than towering above it. He is irked by Hall's inclusion, Yet it is Hall whose study of blood pH that makes the breakthrough about how Andromeda killed, and Hall, who puts together that Andromeda, has become benign. Hall had been assigned because of the silly single man or odd man hypothesis, which said that he was someone better at making the kinds of decisions related to a nuclear device. Hall does indeed do better on the test than all the married men on the team. Is that a vindication of this theory? Well, it could be, but isn't it more likely that we saw that despite not being a deep delver into biomedical specialization like the rest of them, didn't mean that he wasn't the best member of the group at making good decisions? That the only thing the test proved was that, while the others might be more skilled at all this theoretical stuff, Hall's concerns with the practical consequences might just allow him to make better decisions. The Andromeda Strain is a great read, and while dated in some of its aspects, overall it effectively marries science fiction, mystery, and suspense with stimulating ideas and intriguing developments. Much credit needs to go to Crichton's editor, Bob Gottlieb, who realized that what Crichton's book really needed was to make this fiction sound like nonfiction, to make it more cold, neutral, and scientific, to give the sense that we are reading about some classified event that is only now being brought to light. It's all the scarier to think how close we might have been to Armageddon. Science fiction fans might be put off somewhat by the way that Crichton creates wonderful things and then breaks them deliberately. This super complex that nearly self-destructs not only needlessly, but achieving the opposite of its goal. And that not only does the problem solve itself, but the very act of studying it is what nearly causes the catastrophe. That leaving well enough alone, both in orbit and on the ground, would have prevented all of the problems. This dovetails with Stone's own musings, as mentioned, that the benefits of the brain may not be worth it, that the brain can be self-destructive. And we see that in this case, it was thinking we knew what we were doing that nearly doomed us all. But again, this ending can feel pretty unsatisfying. Even the near destruction is lacking in tension because we know that these characters will survive. Crichton has already told us things that these characters will say and do in the future. As a result, the ending can understandably seem a bit of a letdown. But while that may rub some the wrong way, I still feel it's a great book that manages, despite its own obsession with science and technology, to hold on to the human connections too.